Welcome to Commercial Real Estate Now, in partnership with CBRE Econometric Advisors and my co-host Dan Diebel. I'm Carly Iacono. Dan, we're so excited to announce this partnership and kick off our first episode of Commercial Real Estate Now with your co-host and guidance. Let's start, before we jump into today's topic, with a little bit of background on sort of the genesis of CBRE Econometric Advisors and your role there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just start off with saying, hopefully that's the last time you need to say econometric advisors. It took me maybe, I don't know, a year or so to say econometric advisors and not, is it econometrics advisors or is it economic advisors? No,
Right.
it's econometric advisors. And just to
Beautiful.
kind of give the history of where that came from, we were actually started by two very large players in the commercial real estate industry, Bill Wheaton and Ray Torto. And it used to be Torto Wheaton Consulting, and then it became Econometric Advisors. And then at some point within the last 20-ish years or so, I believe CBRE acquired Econometric Advisors. And that's when we kind of became this econometric and economist-centered consulting arm within CBRE. And we do work a little differently in that we have investor clients and we focus on serving those investors as opposed to some of the other research sectors, which are more broker focused. We are focused on serving investors and providing data to them. And we do that through providing forecasts, insights from our economists like me. We have a sector economist for the four major food groups. And then there's also a whole other hotels division that doesn't exactly sit under econometric advisors, but is available through the global forecasting platform at CBRE. Go ahead.
I couldn't be any more excited about this partnership because our goal of this show, and a lot of our listeners have been with us for many years now, is to provide actionable, tangible advice and real data-driven insights to our listeners. So having you on the show as a co-host moving forward is really great, and I'm sure our listeners are very excited about your background and where all the information is coming from as well. So thank you for joining us and for that background.
Very excited to be here. Excited for this partnership. Excited to see what we get to discuss moving forward.
Likewise. And I think that's a perfect way to kick off today's episode. And that is centered around the Q3 retail data that was just released, and specifically some really interesting shifts in retail availability. I want to share the punchline, but I'm not going to because this is your data. So tell me what you found. I need a drum roll, right? The big news from Q3, and then we'll go into what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the small news, which is that availability overall remained basically unchanged if we look at total retail. But if we drill down a little bit deeper and we look at our national level of retail, we see that the neighborhood, community, and strip centers actually saw availability tick up. That means that more space became available. Now, this is big news because this is the first quarter that it's been reported in preliminary statistics that the availability has increased in the neighborhood and community strip center since really about 2016. And that's if we don't include the pandemic. Of course, during the pandemic, our availability skyrocketed and there was a whole mess. So if we take that out, we've really seen falling availability in retail, neighborhood, community, and strip overall for about the past decade. Now, this quarter, I snuck in a few qualifiers there when I talked about it, which was in particular, the preliminary numbers showed an increase in availability in the neighborhood, community, and strip center. But actually, when we went back and we revised our numbers from last quarter with all the information that we get, we get information constantly, and we're constantly updating our histories and revisions to make sure that we have the most accurate defensible numbers that we can. And we actually revised up last quarter's availability as well in the NCS sector. So this is actually 2 quarters of
Interesting.
availability rises in the neighborhood, community, and strip sector, which we haven't seen in the last decade or so if we toss out that COVID era.
Feels almost like the Fed revising the jobs numbers, right? You just have to keep refining it, keep refining, and then you're like, oh, this is a different picture altogether now.
Yeah.
But hopefully not that drastic. But
No.
interesting that this is actually the second quarter that we've seen the uptick in availability, because that's been such a huge talking point for retail for, gosh, like you said, 10 years now, that availability is decreasing and there's still a tremendous tenant demand. And how do we deal with this imbalance of lack of construction and new tenants pushing into the market? And how do we get any skinnier on availability? It looks like we hit that I guess transition point now.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. That I'm yes. I think we're still kind of oscillating around this natural level of availability. And when an economist says natural, that means we're kind of taking out these, shocks to the system that cause availability to bounce around. So I think that the retail sector is going to still hover around this lower level of availabilities. Overall retail probably in the 4 to 5s, mid 4s to 5s, and the neighborhood, community, and strip center overall in the country somewhere in that 5 to 7 range. But we're
So you
not
don't
going to see it fly back up towards the double digits or
good.
anything. So I would hesitate to say this is some sort of trend that we see emerging. When we round the numbers, it looks like availability hasn't changed. So like, it's small uptick and small uptick, lower than 50 basis points on our availabilities. It's not a signal that we're going to see skyrocketing availability. The other aspects are not in place within the commercial real estate sector of retail to see an explosion of availability.
Thank goodness, right? Because we could use just some smooth sailing for a little while in the market. So that makes me happy that you don't think this is going to be a quote explosion of availability, because that would really be an issue. But a slight shift and maybe finding that natural equilibrium is kind of how I'm hearing you say it, right?
Yeah, I think we're going to oscillate kind of
Okay.
around where we are now with those normal shifts of retail is constantly evolving, which means there's constant swirl. And we're going to just see that swirl happen kind of around where it's going to be a little whirlpool around this central availability number, depending on what asset class we're looking at. Across sectors, though, it does look very, very stable, whether we're talking power centers, neighborhood, community, and strip, even if we look at just strip centers or, all these other formats that we could have from freestanding and power centers to malls even are stabilizing.
That's very good news. Were there any surprises in the data? Any outliers or things that you looked at and you went, "Oh, that was unexpected"?
Uh, ooh. So yes, there are always surprises in the data. I'm always surprised. Uh, Part of the most difficult part of what I do is that not only do I have to make a forecast of, oh, is availability going to go up or down, I also have to assign a number to it.
Right.
And I reevaluate that every quarter when we get the numbers. I'm like, okay, where did I miss? Where did I hit? Most of the time, about 61% of the time, if I'm looking at my historical average, I get the direction correct. And that's across
Nice.
our almost 70 markets that we cover. And
Wow.
that's pretty good for
Yeah.
forecasting, right? Like if you
Yeah.
were to use those to invest, you would make money. That's,
Correct. You'd be ahead.
I pat myself on the back for that one. Um, In this latest round, I hit about 30%. So there
Okay.
were a lot more surprises than I would have liked.
Hmm.
Having said that, I was still within one standard deviation or the margin of error of those forecasted numbers on those, which means we didn't see large increases in availability. All of the increases in availability were relatively small. A lot of them were in either major markets or Zoom markets. Part of these Zoom markets, which are like places like Albuquerque or Bend, Oregon, which really benefited from this work from home trend that we've seen emerge. I mean, I'm podcasting from home right now. Uh, those markets have seen increases in availability, but a lot of it is old stock that was removed from the market that now is just being made available again, that has been sitting vacant for, in some cases, 5 years before the pandemic even started. So, yes, we missed on more, but because space is so tight, these old spaces are coming back online, which is
Interesting.
bolstering availability.
I think this
Almost,
is
yeah.
I got to jump in because I want you to give us a basic definition for those listening who maybe aren't familiar of the difference between vacancy and availability.
Oh boy.
We're going
So,
back to classroom. Come on.
you know what's, I had no idea about this difference when I started at EA. And this was one of the first things that I learned, but I was amazed at how difficult it is to find commercial real estate definitions online. There's just not one source of them.
Right.
Luckily for retail, ICSC has done a pretty good job of standardizing the category types. Now, back to your question about availability. Availability just means a space is able to be rented. There may or may not be a tenant in that space. Next, we have vacancy. Now, how we at EA define vacancy is that the space is available and there is no tenant.
Got it.
In retail, there's this other shadow vacancy that exists, which is those spaces that are, for lack of a better word, dead retail spaces. They're not available to rent, they're sitting empty and vacant. There's no way you could feasibly move into that space unless you knew the owner. And that shadow vacancy is the highest it's ever been right now.
Hmm.
If we actually include shadow vacancy in our numbers, the availability rate actually stays flat when we're looking at total vacancy and availability. So, what's really been happening, even though availability has been going down, if we look at it in an overall term, it's that retail space has just been removed from the market and is no longer available to rent. And I think that's still sitting on the psyche of not only consumers, but also those investors in the commercial real estate market, right? Some of them bought retail that now is just sitting vacant and they can't unload it, and that weighs on them and that hurts current investment with this feeling that retail could just go dead.
So
But
that
yeah,
and why do you think that is? Is that they've had it on the market too long? They want to give it some breathing room, so they're taking it off if it was previously offered for lease, or they've never offered it for lease, or maybe it needs too much TI investment that the current owner doesn't want to put in. Like, why do you think that category is increasing?
I think that for a long time, a lot of them were just holding on to tenants in place with in place rents that were very low,
Okay.
no escalation clauses. And then once COVID happened, the tenants were like, well, if I've got to shut down, I don't want to pay rent. And they ended their leases. And then they found other avenues to sell their products or make a living. And that left the demand for that space and also created these spaces that were holding on to finally move out of the market. It burned off all of that excess build that happened through 2007, 2008.
So we're several years past COVID now.
Yes.
Still haunts us, right? Still comes back to all these data points because it happened. But being
Mhm.
that it wasn't just a year or two ago, I'm kind of surprised to hear you say you think it's holdover from COVID days, right? From tenants who were struggling during COVID. Do you think it's that they finally decided to close their business after a few years of struggling post COVID, or are these more on the landlord side that they said, okay, we were hoping for a tenant with double the rent. Maybe we're not going to get it. Let's just take it off market and regroup. Like, is it tenant driven that the spaces are vacant, or do you think it's more landlord driven?
Oh boy, that's a
That might be
really,
theoretical, right? It's
I
kind of hard
mean,
to prove that one way or the other. I was just curious what your sense was.
yeah, I mean, my theory around why they're not there is certainly theoretical. The fact that the space exists and is empty
Okay,
is
we can stick
is
with
that
that.
is data driven. So it is there is a bit of theory going on here, especially because you know tenants and landlords hold all of their data very close to the chest,
Yes,
as well they should.
right.
Um, Having said that, I think, yeah, it's a little bit of both. This feels like such an economist answer, like, oh, it's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of supply and a little bit of demand, and
Right.
we get to this happy little equilibrium. But it is a little bit of both. I think the tenants realized that they had other avenues for selling their products. Like, if we look at new business formation, it really spiked under uh, once PPP was announced. New business formation spiked. Of course, a lot of that was due to the fraud within PPP and the payments that could be received. Now, that new business formation has stayed incredibly high.
Hmm.
And I think it's stayed that high because now we know how to form new businesses. And I think that many of these businesses moved out, learned a new skill, have learned how to market themselves through online avenues, and are now going to start moving back into some of these spaces that they may have vacated with a stronger consumer base, maybe even an e-commerce presence. And I that's a very long answer to say. I think that yes, it was tenant driven at first. They couldn't pay the rent, they didn't want to pay the rent. They left, they learned new skills while they couldn't sell their products. But I do think that most of the studies that we have seen have shown that either e-commerce has a brick and mortar store bolsters your sales regardless of e-commerce, or at the very least does not harm your sales, which
Yeah.
means that we should see more movement into these brick and mortar retail centers than we saw like move outs in the past as these companies kind of grow and have a need for space. If I had individual clients coming to me, I would not host them in my house. I would
Right.
need a retail storefront or an office of some kind
Right.
in order to entertain them.
So this kind of speaks to your equilibrium that we were just touching on, right? You have the tenants that perhaps were holding on after COVID, didn't make it, they're moving out, that's adding some vacancy to the market. Then we have the new tenants with the business formation that have had a few years to really get up and running, and they're realizing the value of bricks and mortar space. So they're out there trying to find new space. So it's the competing forces, right, of turnover, keeping that vacancy overall consistent. Although I still like the headline that there's been a change because change is interesting. But to your
Yeah.
point, the uptick in availability is very modest, and we do feel like we're at a pretty good equilibrium state.
Yeah. Yes.
Very
Absolutely.
nice. Any markets, any locations, areas of the country, suburban, urban, we could take it that way, any states, like any patterns geographically that you think have been interesting in the data?
So if you've, if anyone is tuning in, they've heard me speak at all. I've probably mentioned the suburbs are doing well. They're going to continue to do well for the next 3 to 5 years. That's just kind of how habit formation works. The current occupiers of the suburbs are in a stage in their life cycle that shopping closer to home, staying closer to home is more common. With remote work, we've seen that extend with suburbs doing very well. And in particular, not only for retail, but for multifamily, that inner ring, or what I like to call the urban donut, just mainly because I'm a fan of
Edgy.
donuts.
Okay.
But I believe Nick Bloom also calls it the urban donut. It's much better than the ex-urban ring or the suburban. It's the urban donut. It's that little donut that provides a little bit of cushion between the suburbs and the urban centers. And that and let's keep going with catchy, is the sweet spot right now. That is where we have seen populations and consumers move, in particular, consumers that are moving into these multifamily units that are garnishing higher rents and have seen good rental growth during this post-pandemic period. It's bringing in these consumers with disposable income that then want to spend on retail close to them.
So, how is this reflected in the reports? Are we going to see a new category from econometric advisors that's urban, urban donut, and suburban? Like, how are we gonna see this unfold in the data reporting? Because I love this classification, not just because it's catchy name, but I think it's very smart, right? There's got to be another sort of segment that's not just suburban, because that could be quite far from the cities, and it's not
Yeah.
urban. So how is that reflected in reporting?
Yeah. So currently we have our maps of markets and submarkets. And those are a long process to change because they have been approved not only by ourselves, but also our data providers. They all get their hands in the mix. And that's as far as the data that we at EA provide. We are working on putting those subcategories out there of urban, let's call it urban, donut, and suburban, not under those labels, but we're testing out different maps. And it takes a very long time because once we have a map, even though we've already vetted everything at the building level, now I need to vet it at that map level. And do forecasts make sense at this level? Are these centers actually a good comparison for one another to be forecasting together? Do their rents move together? Do they move opposite? How do I need to tweak the model to account for the fact that we are looking at different populations? Is there enough space to exacerbate rental growth? Is there too little space for rental growth to happen? Are all of these tenants with long-term leases? Are they more grocery anchored? It becomes a much bigger thing when we talk about the actual modeling of the forecasting portion of it, even though sometimes drawing historical statistics for different types of mapping layers can be easy. Vetting them takes a very long time, which is why I'm so glad I work at EA and we have a data team that I don't have to vet absolutely everything. I do love vetting the data when it comes in at first. That's how I find places like Albuquerque that have these strip centers that just magically appear out of nowhere because they've been dormant for 10 years or something like that. So I do love looking at the granularity of the data, but I'm very happy that we have an amazing data team at EA that does a lot of scrubbing and validating, and even more than, and adds to the data that we get from our providers and the data that we get internally in order to create the data sets that we have at EA.
And I think that's really the value right? It's so precise, it's so granular. Um, I think it's unfortunate you can't just create this other category because I find it very interesting, but it wouldn't have the depth, right, and the credibility as you just spoke to. So I'm glad
Yeah.
you shared how it all comes together and how the reports are built because it really does give it a much different layer of significance. And I think it's interesting that you create the same maps, the same things, which makes some of the reports a little dull. No offense, but the good news is you're comparing the same thing. So you really can draw clear insights because when you're reading a lot of other just news, industry news, not the type of information and data that you put out, it's difficult to see if it's the same subset or the same period and are these apples to oranges we're comparing and what really is the takeaway here. So I think the consistency that you just touched on is important. Although I did like the urban donut, but that's fine. We'll set that aside. We don't have to see it in
Well,
the report.
if anybody ever comes to us for bespoke work and wants an urban donut, that certainly moves things forward in those ways,
Yeah,
right? Like the
fair.
moment somebody comes to us and is like, "Hey, can you do this?" and we'll pay you for it, that
You can do
opens
it.
doors, right? Money
Fair.
talks.
Right, right,
Um,
right. Yep.
uh, but yes, I totally agree. I One of my frustrations when I first started was what I think you're saying and experiencing is that sometimes it can be a bit dull, but commercial real estate doesn't change a whole lot. And to try to get apples to apples comparisons with sparser data than you would think is
Mhm.
it's far more difficult than I thought. Like
Right.
we you I don't know. I've been in academia, I've worked in retail, I worked at Plato's Closet for a long time. I worked in childcare, I've worked in hotels, I've lived all over the world. I've seen a lot of things, and every time I'm like, I can do this. I could do this better. And then like slowly I start to learn like, oh, that's why like this one little thing happened. And
Right.
the big thing that EA does that I have learned is really do their best. We do our best to make apples to apples comparisons, especially so that when clients draw the data, and oftentimes it's an analyst pulling the data and using the data to give insights to someone further up. We want to be as sure as possible that we are giving the best apples to apples comparison to our clients so that then when they use the data, they can be assured that they're doing an apples to apples comparison and
Right.
not going to be surprised by something.
Fair, fair, very important. There's one more piece of this availability puzzle I want to touch on before we wrap up for today, and that is the consumer spending piece of the equation. So we talked about what the tenants are doing, we talked about what the landlords are doing, but none of this really matters if we don't have consumer spending. So I guess my first question on this topic is what is the lag, in your opinion, between consumer spending levels shifting and availability? I'm sure it's significant, but do you have any sense of that?
I only hesitate for a moment because we could find the lag between availability and consumer spending. I have all of that data. I I could do that and actually give you a mathematical answer. What I can say right now from how I've looked at the data right now is the comparison between consumer spending and rent growth. And
Interesting.
pre-GFC, consumer spending and rent growth were loosely correlated. Post GFC, after we kind of started the recovery, we do see a higher correlation between rental growth and consumer spending. Now, post COVID, we see a correlation of over, let's say, 97%. It wiggles a little between 97 and 99%, which means consumer spending is finally leading to rental growth in a very direct way. And that's because we finally are seeing retail space be boiled down to the centers and places that matter where consumers want to spend, and that spending is translating into rental growth because it's not being spread out across multiple centers. You know, I my mother would go to like 3 different grocery stores, and she knew what to buy at Grocery Outlet and what to buy at Smith's and what to buy at Walmart and what was cheapest there. And, you know, she went through the coupons and circled them, and she had a whole system planned out. And that has become a lot easier now. But also, most shoppers are trying to fulfill as many of their needs as possible at a single store. Uh, Unlike, you know, the bargain hunters back in
Right.
the day. Yeah.
So there is a correlation, definitely a lag. Mathematically, we could prove that with more time. Um,
Yes.
but you're seeing it show up in rent growth right now. So I wonder, and this is, just something we'll have to watch, if consumer spending slows, how that might affect rent growth and availability moving forward. Haven't really seen it yet, it sounds like, but if the tides turn, we could have effects going the other direction.
Yeah. So if consumer spending slows, and currently we're seeing inflation pick up in the services sector and inflation cool in the goods sector. Services are typically preferred by those in higher income brackets, while goods are preferred by those in lower income brackets because those goods are often closer to necessities than services, right? I don't need to get dry cleaning, but I do need to get food.
Right.
Uh, so when we talk about consumer spending dipping, sometimes we think, oh, well, it's only going to dip out of services or non necessities, and that the necessities are safe. And that's true for spending. But a center, a typical, like if I had to construct a canonical retail center in the neighborhood community and strip kind of genre, is going to have an anchor that represents the good seller. And this is
Mhm.
previous research to prior to when I started EA from the retail economist at the time, who's great. Uh, and she found that anywhere from 50 to 80% of those tenants in like a canonical center are actually providing services and not goods. So you will see some proliferation of that services to increase availability as those servicers are either forced to move out of their centers or find other revenue streams.
Very interesting. I like how you divided that between the goods and the services based on the income brackets. I really haven't heard that
Mhm.
spoken about much in that way, and it makes all the sense in the world. So, not only, of course, do we need to watch consumer spending, we need to watch it by category and type of spend to drill down into the data. I would have expected nothing less in your answer. Makes sense. You're like, actually, let's make this more granular. No,
Oh my gosh,
it's
I love
you're
the
like, that was
consumer.
nothing.
Yeah, I love the consumer. And anytime I can get my hands on new consumer data, and the Fed added some new consumer data, the Visa Spending Index is now there, which is great. And I like it because the consumer confidence index has been uh, very different post COVID. It's now at a totally different low. Like consumers are not confident, but spending has remained hot for so long. But sorry, we
Mhm.
can talk about that at any time. I will talk consumers all day and all night.
I think we
Love to
just
talk about the
teased a future episode there. So
yeah,
I think we'll save that, but know that we will come back to it. We're going to have a very uh, exciting episode on consumer confidence and spending. I already can
great.
tell. It's going to be great. Any concluding thoughts on today's topic of retail availability? We covered a lot. We looked at it from the landlord perspective, the tenant, touched on consumer spending. Anything else you think we left out that we need to mention to paint the full picture?
I'll just give a high level of occupier demand is still high. Yes, bankruptcies continue to be reported, and store closings continue to reported. That's a constant in retail. Don't get scared by them. Everything that we're seeing is showing stability currently in the sector, and that spaces made available are getting snapped up rather quickly. So overall, I kind of expect availability to, hang lower than its long-term average.
Good news. Appreciate you summarizing all of that and leaving us on a positive, honest perspective. Much appreciated. All right. I think that's a wrap. To everyone listening, that was today's episode of Commercial Real Estate Now. We appreciate you tuning in, and we will see you again next month. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you.